There's two Australians up here on the panel, so I apologise in advance for that.
And a Brit over here, so it makes no sense at all.
And a Brit. So we're here today to talk about design for social change, design for sustainable impact. But I'm not a designer. I'm actually a political activist and a movement builder, and I've spent my career building social movements that mobilise, in some cases, millions of people around different issues and problems. And the funny thing is that in my community, in this community of movement builders and political activists, design isn't that fashionable. In fact, there's even an argument that design doesn't matter at all. There's a group that I have enormous respect for that I've worked very closely with called MoveOn.org. Some of you may have heard of it. And MoveOn.org is a big political group here in the US, as you know, that is sort of on the progressive side of politics, mobilizing people. They've got a sort of an anti-design philosophy. So if you go to their website, it's, I wouldn't say that it's inspiring from a design perspective. And so I, as someone who's been building movements, kind of come from this other camp. I'm a little bit obsessed with design. When I was editing the student newspaper back in my university days, I actually wrote an entire article that was a kind of ode to a particularly attractive sans serif font. And so my philosophy, in my view, and it's what I want to talk about with you guys today and give you a few examples and tell a few stories, is that if we're in the business of social change, if we're in the business of inspiring people to take large-scale action that are going to both change their behaviour and change societies, we actually have to take design very seriously. And so when I started Purpose, which is this sort of home for movement building, we actually decided to bring in people who were interaction designers and visual designers who would obsess on those things because we felt like we'd do a better job at moving more people to action. So let me tell you a couple of quick stories to give you a little bit of a flavour for this. This is an organisation that I co-founded back home in Australia. And so let me describe the scene when we started this organisation. So it was 2005. There was this guy in power called John Howard that Simon will know. I didn't agree with almost anything John Howard stood for. A very conservative guy, dragged the country back 30 years. He was locking up refugees. He was refusing to take any action on climate change. And the opposition parties, the established political parties, were frankly in the toilet. Their brand was for naught. So there was really deep disenchantment among the people who were opposed to John Howard, and the brands, if you like, that existed in Australian politics to take him on just had no capital. So we decided to create a new organisation that didn't feel like a political party. So we didn't call it the Australian Democracy Union or the, Party for, the Unification of Progressive Australians. We called it Get Up. And what we wanted to do was make it feel like a brand that ordinary people could get excited to get involved in. To speak to the theme of more with less, when we started this organisation, we really had less. We didn't have a large movement. So we started this television ad when we launched the organisation with this sort of bold claim that Australians are starting a new movement. But, this is just my sister and my niece. And that was really just, that was the social movement. But no one knew that. And interestingly, we grew Get Up, and because we'd created this brand that was, very young, invited participation, had real energy, and that was everything from the brand itself, which was kind of a call to action, to the way we did the visual design, to the way we constructed the voice of the organisation. It grew incredibly quickly, and even though we were these total outsiders who started with no money and no people and just a couple of family members, within a couple of years Get Up had grown, and it's now the largest political group in the country, and it actually has more members than all of the political parties put together. And so it's a really instructive story of how if you create something that really invites participation and that takes ordinary people seriously, you can do that well. And, part of Get Up was sort of partly actually inspired by Move On and its organising model. But we decided to do a few things differently. And we decided that the organisation needed a voice that had a little bit of levity, that wasn't too earnest. So there are moments where we'll engage our membership on really serious, heavy stuff. Human rights abuses, etc. And, at those times, we don't make jokes. But, at other times, we've done really extraordinary things that have, tapped that uniquely Australian sense sense of humour. So to give you one example of that, there's the very conservative politician in Australia who is anti-refugees. And there was a charity auction in which a surfing lesson with this man was being auctioned off to basically corporate fat cats. And so we said, you know what, we'll get our membership, because we now have, almost 600,000 people, which in Australian terms, in our little country of 20 million, is actually a lot. We said, okay, let's actually buy the surfing lesson with this guy, Tony Abbott, this politician, using a crowd-funded membership model. And of course, who would he have to give the surfing lesson to? But a refugee. And these are the kinds of things that capture the imagination. So we're actually highlighting a very important issue, but in a voice and in a manner that's really engaging. So here's another organisation that we recently started at Purpose. It's called All Out. And we decided that there was a big gap, which was that we needed to build a mass movement for LGBT rights. Now, LGBT already is a bit of an alphabet soup, right? I'm sure everybody knows what it stands for because we're here in New York City, but a lot of people around the world don't actually know what it even means. And so we needed to build a mass movement for LGBT people and straight people around the world that would actually create something that got us out of the alphabet soup and created a populist movement which we hope will become the largest ever community of LGBT people to really take this historic fight on at the global level. So this is the brand that we created and the name that we created to embody that. And in just 4 months since we launched, we've already mobilized and signed up more than 500,000 people in 190 countries. And you've had other organisations that have been doing terrific policy work but haven't done this piece well, this communications piece and the mass mobilisation piece, and that, despite 20 years of very solid work, haven't been able to mobilise these mass audiences. So, there's a different set of skills and a different toolkit required for mass mobilisation, and that's what we're trying to figure out at Purpose. So we put together this video, which I won't play for you, but is just something that we kind of hashed together, where we got people in places all over the world to hold up signs to launch All Out. And part of what we were trying to do is, and this is a lot of what we have to do in our work, is create really global designs and brands. So we have to create things that translate really well globally and that have a feeling that can really carry forth. And so this is an example of, it's a still from that ad. A couple more quick examples. This is some work that we did with Livestrong. The puzzle for Livestrong was they had a great brand. They didn't need any help from us on beautiful design, right? But there was almost like a challenge, which is they were sort of trapped by their brand. So they'd sold millions of these wristbands and everybody was really compelled by that, but they didn't know how to actually turn that beautiful design, that beautiful engagement into real action, into a robust movement. So after people bought the wristband, they're sort of there wasn't a lot for them to do, and often those people would be lost. So we created basically a platform to mobilize those people in a more robust and sustainable way. And one example was this thing called I Ride For, where people played essentially a virtual ride when the Tour of California was on, where you picked your ride. You could be a whole bunch of colours and genders, and you basically got to participate in this ride. And what it meant was that you were riding in honour of someone that you knew who had cancer. And in doing so, you needed to engage your friends and family to cheer for you. And in cheering for you, people joined the movement. And in a very short time, we had a huge number of people join the Livestrong movement because we'd created a way that was a very simple, low barrier entry point for them to participate, but we'd personalised their experience of activism. So suddenly they had a reason to be involved in the movement, and that was the person that they were riding for, a person that maybe they knew who had cancer or had died of cancer, or if they themselves were a person who'd had cancer, in honour of their caregivers. And that proved to be a very robust entry point for further engagement. And one last example in the beautiful city of Rio. And actually, Natura is a great example of the kind of progressive brand that exists and the kind of the atmosphere in Brazil that makes something like this possible. This is a new organization that we're starting for the people of Rio. Rio is having this wonderful moment in the sun with the Olympics and the World Cup coming. And so we wanted to create a platform for ordinary people to get involved in the city and to hold their government to account as it spends hundreds of millions of dollars on these major events, as it does things like tries to evict certain favelas in order to make way for Olympic development, etc. So we created a new organization called MUJI, which means My Rio, which we've recently had to kind of construct, and Lee Shawn, who's here, was one of the architects of this and of the creation of this new identity. And our challenge was, how do we invite participation? How do we create a brand that feels like it's ownable by the people of Rio? And so what we did is we took the shape of a coconut, and Lee Shawn and a team from Purpose went to Rio and did a whole bunch of ethnographic research, not a hard job. And people were lining up to do this ethnographic research, I've got to tell you. And they went to the beaches of Rio, and they found out that one of the more democratic symbols of Rio was the fact that whether you were upper middle class or whether you were in a favela, you drank coconut water on the beach. And there were people who would sell coconut water and coconuts that you would drink on the beach. And that this was a symbol of the more egalitarian part of Rio, which we needed to identify. And so we built the brand around that, and we were inspired by the Brazilian modernism that we saw, and by the street art, which was also an important common thread in Brazil. And finally, have a look at this. The Obama campaign was one of the first political campaigns that actually, as we all know, used design in an interesting way. And one of the things that I'm struck and amused by is that this was this great design intervention. And now what you see are all of these hilarious, this is not this slide, but all of these hilarious copycat websites where people are using the exact same Obama design. So they're so uncreative that they're like, well, if we just use this font and that drop shadow, it'll feel like President Obama. But the Obama brand here, actually very powerful, showed how you could create something that was really repurposable and ownable by others. So the very iconic Obama design was sort of repurposed by all of these different groups, by LGBT people, by progressive Christians, etc. And you see how all of these symbols take the central icon of the Obama campaign and make it something that's ownable and democratic. This is just a very brief explanation of how we do our work to speak to this more is less problem. We heard a little bit about choice paralysis as a fundamental problem. Our movements have to engage with that and address that problem. So you need to give people very easy ways to engage and funnel that engagement. So if you go to a website and you're like, here are the 7 things you can do, you tend to get very low action rates because people are kind of paralyzed by choice and they're not focused with real stories. So we have this concept of a commitment curve where we give people a very easy low barrier entry point, and then we find a way to create a relationship with them to capture their information and to systematically move them up the curve. Finally, I want to leave you with an important kind of point about how we think about movement building and design, which is, let's not just create beautiful experiences. Let's not just create these ephemeral things of beauty. Like, there's no glory, in my view, in the YouTube hit that gets, on some social issue, that gets seen by 2 million people and is then forgotten. So what we try to do with our work is we try to create, as I've shown you with some of these examples, real movement brands that are there for the long term to create, essentially power in those areas, to consolidate the power of ordinary people and to combine that power in new ways using technology. But in order to do that, you need to be focused on sustainability. So that's why some of our movements actually are funded by ordinary people who become members of the movements and use a microdonations model, so that some of our movements are now making millions or even tens of millions of dollars a year to support that kind of work. So those are a few thoughts, and look forward to engaging in the discussion and hearing from Simon.